I had no idea that a peaceful evening at home would become something I would later regret. I was 35 years old, working as an IT consultant in London and leading a nice life. I was still getting used to the notion of being single again after going through a difficult split. The majority of my evenings were spent working late into the night or binge-watching Netflix. I didn't want to date. I liked living alone in my apartment better than dealing with the hassles of new relationships. I rarely spoke to my neighbors outside of the occasional wave or courteous gesture because I lived in a quiet area of Chelsea. It was a quiet life, and I enjoyed it that way. However, all changed one evening when my neighbor's wife, Isabel, knocked on my door without warning. Isabel had moved here a few months prior with her husband, Robert. Both were in their early 40s, successful and effortlessly elegant, making them a lovely couple. Particularly Isabel was the type of lady who attracted attention wherever she went. She was confident and poised, with long dark hair, bright green eyes, and an effortless elegance. Although we had spoken politely a few times, I never gave it any thought outside of the typical neighborly exchanges. I was watching a movie and getting some takeout on a dreary Friday night when I heard someone knock. I was taken aback when I opened the door and saw Isabel standing there with a bottle of wine in one hand and an umbrella in the other. She smiled broadly and said, "Hello, Sam. Hopefully, I'm not bothering you." "Hello, Isabel," I said, moving aside to make room for her. "Not at all. Enter. It's raining outside." She shook off her umbrella and put it aside, saying, "Thanks. I apologize for the unexpected visit, but I wanted to stop by and say hello since Robert is out of town on a business trip. If you don't mind, I brought some wine." Although I was taken by surprise, I saw no danger. After all, it was merely a friendly gesture, and we were neighbors. "Yes, why not?" Grinning, I nodded. "Come in and settle in. I'll go get my glasses." We poured ourselves glasses of wine and sat on the couch as the rain drummed against the windows. Sitting there with Isabel felt oddly cozy, and the talk flowed naturally. We discussed our professions, the neighborhood, and the seemingly never-ending rain that besets London. Looking around, Isabel said, "You've got a nice place." "It's comfortable," I said, a little self-conscious. "Thank you. It's simple, but it works for me." Her eyes lingered on mine for a second longer than was necessary as she grinned. "It fits you," she repeated in a quiet voice. The moment of stillness felt fraught with something unsaid, and there was a little pause. I made an effort to ignore it, attributing it to the wine and the evening's warmth. I couldn't help but notice Isabel's steady attention and slightly knowing smile as we carried on our conversation. The discussion became increasingly intimate as the evening wore on. Isabel talked candidly about her marriage and the difficulties of having a husband like Robert who is constantly at work and rarely at home. She spoke with a mixture of sadness and rage, losing her temper as she let her emotions out. She admitted with a hint of resentment, "It's like I'm married to his job. He never stops traveling and is constantly looking for the next big transaction. I sometimes question whether he even acknowledges my existence." Unsure of what to say, I listened. She was obviously in pain, and I felt a twinge of compassion for her. However, there was also another element, a glimmer of interest and fascination that I couldn't completely ignore. "I apologize, Isabel," I murmured softly. "That sounds really difficult." She took a sip of her wine and nodded. "Yes, it is. You know, I never imagined marriage would be like this. I assumed that we would share our lives and be partners. However, I feel alone most of the time." I extended my arm and put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not by yourself," I said. "You have family and friends. And if you ever need to talk, I'm right next door." Her eyes were sparkling with unshed tears as she gazed at me. "I'm grateful, Sam. That is very significant." The world appeared to disappear for a second as our eyes met. My heart was pounding, and there was a lot of tension between us that I couldn't express. Isabel's eyes fell to my lips, and before I could comprehend what was happening, she moved in and gently pressed her lips to mine. Even though the kiss was timid and soft, it sent me a shock of energy. I knew I should back off, stop it before it got any worse, but I was unable to do so. My hand moved to cup her cheek as I gave her a deeper kiss in return. We were both gasping for air and pressing our foreheads into one another when we eventually separated. With regret and need in my voice, I muttered, "Isabel, this is not possible." With her eyes still closed, she whispered, "I know, but I'm powerless to stop it." We sat silently as the consequences of our deeds hung over us like a thick mist. I knew we had crossed a boundary, that there would be consequences, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. There was a connection between us, a spark that I hadn't felt in a long time, and it was impossible to ignore. I finally murmured, "We should stop," but my voice lacked conviction. "Robert isn't treated fairly." Isabel gave a nod. Her face hurt. "You're correct. It's unfair. However, Sam, I'm so sick of being alone. All I wanted was to feel anything. More than I wanted to acknowledge, I knew what she meant. I was all too familiar with the loneliness and the need for connection. Nevertheless, I was aware that we couldn't go in this direction. It was too complicated, too dangerous. Maybe we just got caught up in the moment, I murmured, while my heart wrenched at the prospect of letting go. "We can simply accept it as an error and go on." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced by the sorrow in her eyes. "Maybe." With a heavy, uneasy tension in place of the pleasant banter we had earlier, we drank our wine in quiet. Isabel offered me a little, dejected grin as she eventually stood up to go. "Sam, thank you for the wine, as well as for listening." "Anytime," I murmured softly. "Isabel, be careful." I leaned against the door as I shut it after her, my thoughts racing over everything that had transpired. I was aware that I had erred by allowing my feelings to influence my decision-making. In actuality, though, I couldn't get myself to feel bad about it. A part of me was happy Isabel had stopped by, that we had spent that little, forbidden moment together. And I was afraid of that. There was a mixture of perplexity and shame in the days that followed. I made an effort to ignore the kiss in order to concentrate on my work and stay occupied, but it was impossible. The memories of that night flooded back every time I heard Isabel's voice from next door or saw her while passing. And then, a week later, she texted me, "Sam, I realized that last time was strange. If I went too far, I apologize. Can we have a conversation?" My heart was pounding as I gazed at the letter. I was aware that I should ignore it, maintain my distance, and wait for everything to settle down. However, the allure remained, the temptation too great to ignore. "Yes. Are you coming over tonight?" We decided to meet later that night, and as the time drew near, I had a mixture of nerves and excitement. I couldn't help myself, even though I knew we were taking too much danger and playing with fire. In order to discuss things and possibly find some closure, I wanted to see her. Isabel was anxious when she came, and her smile was a bit too forced. She said, "Hello," and entered. "I appreciate you letting me visit," I said, "Of course," and shut the door after her. "Would you like a beverage?" She settled down on the couch and said, "Just water. Thanks." The stillness between us was unpleasant and oppressive as I joined her after pouring us each a glass of water. I knew we needed to speak it out, but I wasn't sure how to begin or how to handle what had transpired. Relating to the other night, Isabel, I started, but she interrupted me right away. With sadness in her voice, she apologized to Sam. "I should never have given you a kiss. It was incorrect, and I don't want to add to the already difficult situation." Even though her comments made my heart sink, I nodded. "It's all right." Both of us became engrossed in the moment. However, perhaps it would be best if we simply forgot about it and moved on. She gazed at me with sorrow in her eyes. "I'd like to forget. But the fact is, Sam, you're always on my mind. I'm not sure what to do." A wave of emotions, including uncertainty, desire, and remorse, washed over me when she made her confession. I felt I needed to say something, to end it for good, but I was at a loss for words. Finally, with a trembling voice, I murmured, "Isabel, I care about you, but this is too disorganized. I don't wish to cause harm to anyone." She put her hand on mine and reached out. "I understand. I also don't want to harm Robert. However, I can't continue to act as though nothing is wrong." I'm not sure where that leaves us, so I need to figure things out. With my head racing, I gripped her hand. I was aware that we were at a turning point and that we had to decide before things became any more difficult. However, the attraction between us remained, more powerful than before. I said, maybe we just take it one step at a time, but I had no idea what that actually meant. At this time, we don't need to know all the answers. She tightened her hold on my hand as she nodded. Indeed, one action at a time. The burden of our predicament weighed heavily on us as we sat in silence for some time. I was aware that we were taking a risk that was too great for a little moment of intimacy. However, I couldn't force myself to leave Isabel while I stared at her. The weeks that followed were filled with secret rendezvous and snatched glances. I maintained seeing Isabel, but we kept our relationship as casual as possible. However, the tension between us never completely went away, and I felt that a confrontation was inevitable. Then, one afternoon, I ran into Robert in the corridor as I was leaving my apartment. Totally unaware of the conflict that had been simmering between his wife and me, he greeted me with his typical warm smile. He gave me a back pat and said, "Hey, Sam. I've been meaning to ask you to join me for dinner at some point. I would adore having you with Isabel." I forced a grin and nodded as Robert went on, but the guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I realized that in order to stop the covert meetings and the stolen moments, I had to break up with Isabel. Both she and Robert weren't treated fairly. I emailed Isabel that night to invite her over. Her face told me she knew what was going to happen when she finally showed up. Her voice cracked as she begged, "Please don't, Sam. I can't. I know what you're going to say." "This must end," I interrupted in a stern tone. "It's wrong, Isabel. I can't continue like this." She nodded, her shoulders dropping in defeat as tears filled her eyes. "I understand. I simply am so over feeling isolated." "I understand," I replied gently as I gathered her in an embrace. "However, this isn't the solution. Robert and you both deserve better." For a brief while, we hugged each other while we both struggled with the truth of our circumstances. Even while I felt we had made the right choice, it didn't make things any simpler. I felt like I was losing a piece of myself when I let go of Isabel, and I wasn't sure how to proceed. The weight of our decisions hung heavily in the air as I watched her leave that evening. Although I was aware that we had erred and had gone too far, I also understood that we needed to accept accountability for our deeds. Ultimately, I came to the conclusion that certain relationships, no matter how strong, are not meant to be. And sometimes letting go and growing from the experience is the best course of action. We needed this ending, even though it wasn't the one I had dreamed for. I realized it was time to start anew and find a fresh way forward as I shut the door. One step at a time.